The gates are sealed. Outside the walls, an army stretches in every direction you can see. Tents, fires, soldiers who have nowhere else to be and nothing but time. Inside the walls, you have exactly what was stored before the gates closed. And not one grain more is coming in. No trade, no supply lines, no rescue on the horizon. This isn't a battle you can win by fighting harder. This is a countdown, and everyone inside the city can feel it ticking. A siege wasn't really a fight between armies. It was a fight against a clock, and the walls that were supposed to keep you safe are the exact same walls now sealing you inside with everyone you love and nothing to eat. To understand how dark this actually got, you have to understand what a siege really was. It wasn't an attempt to break down the walls and storm in, though that sometimes happened. Far more often, an attacking army would simply surround a city or castle and wait, cutting off every route for food, water, and reinforcements, betting that starvation would do the work that swords couldn't. And it was a bet that paid off constantly because most medieval cities and castles, however well fortified, only stored enough food to last weeks or a few months at best. Sieges regularly dragged on far longer than that, sometimes stretching past a year, which meant that for the people trapped inside, the real enemy was rarely the army outside the walls. It was their own dwindling stockpile, disappearing a little more every single day with absolutely no way to replace it. The first stage of a long siege always looked the same. Rationing began almost immediately. Portions cut smaller and smaller as officials tried to stretch supplies as far as they could. Once grain reserves started running critically low, people turned to eating the animals that weren't meant to be food at all. Horses went first, animals worth more alive for cavalry and labor than as meat, but starvation doesn't leave room for strategy. During the siege of Jerusalem in the year 70, ancient historian Josephus recorded people in the city eating leather from their belts and sandals, boiling it down to something barely chewable, just to put anything at all into an empty stomach. Rats, mice, and other vermin, normally considered filthy and avoided entirely, became genuine food, hunted and eaten because a source of protein, any source, mattered more than discussed at that point. In multiple documented sieges across medieval Europe, records describe people boiling old leather goods, shoes, harnesses, book bindings, extracting whatever nutrition could possibly be pulled from material never meant to be eaten at all. This wasn't rare desperation limited to a single unlucky city. This was the standard, predictable second act of nearly every siege that dragged on long enough, repeated across different centuries and different continents with grim consistency. But rationing and eating leather were only the beginning, because starvation doesn't just break down bodies, it breaks down the structure holding a community together, and that's where the story gets genuinely dark. As food grew scarcer, wealthier residents and those with connections to power often managed to hoard supplies while everyone else went without, creating black markets inside the besieged walls themselves, where a single loaf of bread could cost more than a family's entire savings. Resentment and desperation built alongside the hunger, and city leaders facing dwindling supplies eventually confronted a horrifying calculation. With limited food and too many mouths to feed, who gets to eat and who doesn't? In multiple documented medieval sieges, the answer was as brutal as it sounds. City leaders forcibly expelled what were coldly referred to at the time as the useless mouths. The elderly, the very young, the sick, and the poor, anyone judged unable to contribute to the city's defense, pushing them out through the gates and directly into the no man's land between the walls and the besieging army. These weren't people being sent to safety. They were being sent to die in the open, stripped of shelter and unwanted by either side, because the attacking army often refused to let them pass through their lines either, not wanting to feed them and not wanting to let them return to consume the city's remaining supplies. Contemporary accounts from multiple sieges describe crowds of expelled civilians, families among them, trapped and starving in that narrow strip of ground between two armies, visible to everyone on both sides, while the siege continued on above and around them. It's one of the coldest, most calculated decisions recorded from this entire period of history, made not by soldiers in the heat of battle, but by city officials deliberately as policy to keep the defenders fed a little longer. And when even that wasn't enough, when the leather was gone, the rats were gone, and the weakest had already been pushed outside the gates to die, some sieges crossed into territory that's almost unbearable to describe, but is documented clearly enough that historians can't dismiss it as rumor or exaggeration. During the siege of Jerusalem, Josephus recorded an account, almost too horrifying to repeat, of a starving mother during the absolute worst of the famine who killed and ate her own infant child, driven to an act she herself described as monstrous, but one she committed anyway because starvation had stripped away every other option available to her. During the First Crusade's siege of Ma'ara in the year 1098, multiple separate chronicler accounts, written independently by different witnesses, describe starving Crusader soldiers resorting to cannibalism on the bodies of the dead. Accounts corroborated closely enough across multiple independent sources that historians generally accept them as substantially accurate rather than wartime exaggeration or propaganda. During the ancient siege of Numantia in Spain, Roman historians recorded that trapped defenders, facing certain starvation with no hope of relief, resorted to eating the bodies of those who had already died rather than surrender the city, choosing that horror over submission until the very end. These weren't isolated, unverifiable legends passed down through vague folklore. They were recorded in some cases by multiple independent witnesses as the documented factual endpoint of what sustained total starvation actually does to human beings once every other option has been completely exhausted. The line between civilization and this outcome, it turns out, isn't nearly as far away as most people assume. It's just however many weeks it takes for the food to run out completely. Not every siege ended this way. Some cities held out with clever rationing, hidden supply routes, or relief armies that arrived just in time. Some surrendered early enough to avoid the worst of it, choosing occupation over starvation once the writing on the wall became unmistakable. But the sieges that dragged on long enough, the ones where no relief ever came and surrender was refused or denied, followed this same grim progression again and again across different eras, different armies, different continents with a consistency that should genuinely unsettle you. Rationing. Then animals never meant to be eaten. Then leather and vermin. Then the expulsion of the weakest to die in the open ground between two armies who both refused them. And in the very worst, most extreme cases, the very last line, the one modern people assume could never actually be crossed anyway. So here's the question worth sitting with, because there's no comfortable answer to it. If the gates sealed right now, if the food ran out week after week with no relief in sight and no way out, at what point do you think the line would actually move for you? Not in theory. Not as a hypothetical you can safely dismiss from a comfortable distance. Genuinely. How many weeks of watching people you love get hungrier and weaker before every certainty you have about who you are and what you'd never do starts to feel a lot less solid than it does right now?